The most frequent question from those who doubt that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface on July 21, 1969 is, did we have the necessary technology for such a feat? To answer, let's start with the early days of lunar exploration. And no, we're not talking about NASA's Apollo program. The Soviets were the first to target our satellite. In the late 1950s, they launched the Lunar program, which consisted of 24 missions aiming to gather information using probes and artificial satellites. On September 14, 1959, 10 years before humans arrived on the moon, the Soviets managed to crash a spherical probe 90 centimeters in diameter and weighing 390 kilograms on its surface called Luna 2. And we say succeeded because that was the objective of the probe, to crash into the moon, hitting the target like a cannonball, since the probe had no propulsion system. Less than a month later, on October 10, 1959, another probe, Luna 3, managed to photograph the far side of the moon for the first time. Although most of you already know this, we will briefly explain the dark side. The moon orbits the Earth and rotates on its axis, just as the Earth orbits the Sun and rotates on its own axis. The moon takes the same time to rotate on its axis as it does to orbit the Earth, so it always shows the same face towards our planet. All right, let's get back to the Soviet probes. After several failed attempts to land their probes gently without crashing, on February 3, 1966, the Luna 9 probe managed to land on the lunar surface and sent photographs and data from there for 3 days. Did you think the television images of Apollo 11 were the first taken on the moon? Well, no. The first image captured by humans on the surface of our satellite was this. This is an image of the region known as the Ocean of Storms. On the other hand, 5 years earlier, in 1961, the Soviets had already managed to send a man into space, Yuri Gagarin, followed by many others, both Soviet and American. Let's not forget that the main engine of exploration beyond our planet was precisely that space race between the Soviets and the Americans during the Cold War. Just 23 days after Gagarin's orbital flight, the American Alan Shepard made a suborbital flight. But unlike the Russian, Shepard was able to control some parameters of the flight and return to Earth aboard his ship, not by parachuting. This is why NASA considers him the first astronaut of his country. Remember the name Alan Shepard because it will appear later. As the Soviet Union had beaten the United States by being the first to put a satellite into orbit Sputnik, to send a living being into space, the dog Laika aboard Sputnik 2 and to put a human Gagarin and into orbit, the Americans put all their efforts into being the first to place a man on the surface of the moon. By the way, in case you're wondering, Laika didn't survive long up there. In October 2002, one of the scientists who participated in that project, Dmitry Malyshenkov, revealed that the dog died between 5 and 7 hours after takeoff, due to the stress and overheating of Sputnik 2. But let's go back to the space race. As we said, the Americans turned to their Apollo program, which aimed to land on the moon. They invested $25.4 billion at the time, which today would be equivalent to about $170 billion. That is close to the annual gross domestic product, GDP, of a country like Hungary. In short, the technology was available, as both the Americans and the Soviets had shown, and so were the resources. Landing on the moon was only a matter of time, and it was finally achieved, as we mentioned, on July 21, 1969, with the Apollo 11 mission. This brings us to the second question you asked the most in our survey. If we really got to the moon, why haven't we gone back? The answer is very simple. Of course we went back. A total of 29 astronauts participated in the manned missions of the Apollo program, and 12 of them set foot on the moon. Apart from Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin from the Apollo 11 mission, Charles Pete Conrad and Alan Bean from Apollo 12 also walked up there. Edgar Mitchell and Alan Shepard. Do you remember him? Who traveled on Apollo 14? David Scott and James Irwin of Apollo 15. John Young and Charlie Duke of Apollo 16. And Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt from Apollo 17. All these missions were carried out between 1969 and 1972. After 6 successful moon landings, once the historic milestone of beating the Soviets in the race to the moon had been achieved, the U.S. authorities decided to cancel the Apollo 18, 19, and 20 missions due to budget constraints. In addition, the social climate was no longer as supportive. Once the initial euphoria for the feat of 1969 had passed, The following moon landings only seem to contribute rocks and more sad and nondescript rocks, not new minerals with extraordinary properties. On the other hand, the long and unpopular war in Vietnam undermined public support for large government military projects, and the space program was seen as part of that policy. In other words, they did step on the moon again after Apollo 11. Unfortunately, history and textbooks only remember the first to do something, which is why so many people still think that only Armstrong and Aldrin stepped on the moon. A curiosity: everyone knows Armstrong's first words as soon as he arrived. But do you know what are for now? The last words spoken by a human on the moon? Gene Cernan told his Apollo 17 partner Harrison Schmitt, "Are you ready? Let's get this out of here." Another argument that debunks most conspiracy theories is the behavior of the Soviets. If it had been a fraud, a worldwide hoax filmed on a movie set, they would have been the first to denounce it, given the great rivalry between the two superpowers at the time. But they didn't say a word. They never protested or accused the Americans of deceiving humanity. Why? Because they knew it had really happened since it was feasible, and they themselves were close to achieving it. Do you remember the Lunar program, the one we told you about at the beginning of the video? Well, the Soviets kept developing it. In fact, their greatest success was achieved the year after the Apollo 11 feat, in December 1970, when they managed to leave a remote-controlled vehicle on the lunar surface, the Lunar 1, which traveled more than 10 kilometers and remained operational for 322 days, sent thousands of images and analyzed the soil and subsoil. One of the people who operated the robot from Earth, the Russian Vyacheslav Dovgin, declared in 2015 in his country's media that he himself, through Lunar 1, witnessed the footprints left by Apollo 11 and its astronauts in the place where they landed in 1969. A few years after the Lunar 1 mission, in 1976, the Soviets decided to forget about the moon and focus their efforts on a new field, space stations. In case you're wondering, Lunar 1 is still up there. When the instrument pack's heating battery died, it froze and the Soviets lost contact with it. They did not know its exact position, and it was considered lost. But in 2010, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter probe, which was orbiting our satellite to map its surface, located Lunar 1. That same year, a team led by Professor Tom Murphy at the University of California at San Diego sent pulses of laser light from the Apache Point Observatory in New Mexico to the coordinates indicated by the NASA probe and received the return signal from the Soviet vehicle's retroreflector. More questions from the survey. Isn't it true that there are photos of the Apollo 11 astronauts in which it is clear they were taken on a film set? The answer is yes, but no. There are images like this, in which Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin appear taking lunar samples, and in the background, we can see other people, stairs, spotlights, cameras, etc. This was taken on April 22, 1969, and they were obviously not on the moon. It was a training session. But many conspiracy theorists believe they are proof that the moon landing images are fake. NASA offers more than 8,000 images of the Apollo missions on its website, but many people continue to doubt their veracity, especially those of the Apollo 11 mission. Where do the theories of the skeptics come from? Naturally, it is impossible to trace a common origin for all of them, but certain milestones in recent decades have marked the spread of denialist thought. While it is true that from the outset, some doubted the veracity of what they had seen on television in the late 1990s, various surveys in the U.S. showed a total of about 12 million skeptics. That is barely 6% of the population. That percentage skyrocketed as a result of the broadcast on the Fox network in 2001 of a documentary titled Conspiracy Theory: Did We Land on the Moon? In that documentary, Bill Kasing, a librarian who in 1976 published a book titled We Never Went to the Moon, led the theories. In that documentary, Kasing claimed the moon landing had been filmed near Las Vegas, in the famous Area 51. He said it without proof but without doubt, and in the documentary, although some members of NASA were involved, they were not told. They listened to refute his ideas point by point, but only in general terms, which seemed to confirm that there were no satisfactory answers to the alleged inconsistencies of the false moon landing denounced by Kasing. As a result of that documentary, sales of Kasing's book skyrocketed, and he, for many, became the father of the lunar fraud hypothesis. Skepticism spread, and the echoes of Kasing's arguments multiplied on the internet, showing it was all a universal hoax. In the documentary, to give Kasing authority, they presented him as an analyst and engineer for the Rocketdyne Company, which had built the Saturn V, the rocket that carried Apollo 11 to the moon. But in reality, Kasing was not an engineer, but an English literature graduate who had worked in that company as a manual writer. Furthermore, he left the company in 1963, before the Saturn V was even designed. If there is no atmosphere on the moon, how could the flag wave? The answer is simple. There is a very thin atmosphere on the moon, so thin it's usually said there isn't one. It's not capable of making a flag wave. The flag the astronauts carried had a top rod that held it like a curtain. Because what's the use of planting a flag on the moon if it isn't going to be seen? The wrinkles making it look like it's waving are because it was folded in the lunar module and the astronauts weren't very skilled at placing it. And why don't you see the stars in the sky of the photos supposedly taken on the moon? Kasing also wondered. The reason is simple. Since the lunar surface reflects sunlight very intensely, the exposure time with which the mission cameras took pictures was very short, so that they wouldn't be blurred. For this reason, the brightness of the stars in the background, much weaker than that of the ground, could not be registered. Among the arguments of those who doubt the arrival of humans on the moon, it is also common to find concerns about the radiation in the Van Allen belts. To reach the moon, you need to cross those regions of the Earth's magnetosphere, where large amounts of high-energy charged particles are concentrated. Wouldn't passing through there have ended up killing the astronauts? No, because NASA was aware of that danger, and the manned missions of the Apollo program were designed to pass through the Van Allen belts quickly, so the extra radiation received by the crew was minimal and did not pose any risk to their health. Another question from the survey was, didn't they hire the film director Stanley Kubrick to film the fake moon landing? Absolutely not. That's just an urban legend that originated in 1995 on Usenet, news and discussion forums that were the forerunners of today's social networks. In one of these groups, which was humorous, a joke emerged that in 1968, just after Kubrick released his film 2001: A Space Odyssey, NASA had contacted him to take charge of filming the first 3 moon landings. But that joke became more prominent when, in 2002, the French channel Arte broadcast a mockumentary titled Operation Moon, directed by William Carroll, which claimed the Apollo 11 moon landing was staged by Richard Nixon and shot by Kubrick. The documentary included interviews with then CIA Director Richard Helms, Secretary of State Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense Henry Kissinger, and even Buzz Aldrin and Stanley Kubrick's widow, Christiane Kubrick. All seemed to confirm the conspiracy hypothesis. How was it possible? Only at the end of the documentary was it indicated that it was a false report, showing false shots, making it clear that all these personalities had actually been asked about the Watergate scandal, then cut off their answers and set up the farce. The delay in radio transmissions between the moon and Earth, due to the distance of 400,000 kilometers, was only 1.5 seconds. By the way, the first to know that Apollo 11 had landed on the moon weren't in Houston, but in Spain, specifically at the Fresnadillas de la Oliva station, 50 kilometers west of Madrid. Fresnadillas was one of the 3 largest antennas of the Apollo program monitoring network, distributed worldwide to allow NASA to communicate with the astronauts at all times. At the time of the moon landing, the best located antenna was the Spanish one, so when Neil Armstrong said from the moon, "Houston Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed," that sentence reached Fresnadillas a second and a half later, and another half-second later, it finally reached Houston. But many who vehemently believed the moon landing was false accepted that documentary as further proof of the mega conspiracy. More questions. Is it possible the transmission of the moon landing was real, but it wasn't broadcast live but delayed, in case the mission ended in tragedy? No, it wasn't like that. It is true that the authorities prepared for the worst-case scenario, but their contingency plan did not include hiding the tragedy, but simply reading a 2-page statement written by William Safire, Nixon's speechwriter. It was titled, "In Case of Disaster on the Moon," and began with the following words: "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore it in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know there is no hope of rescue. But they also know that there is hope for humanity with their sacrifice." More than 500 million people around the world watched that historic moment. Among the most striking questions some of you have asked us is, And what about those conversations between the Apollo 11 astronauts in which they talk about seeing extraterrestrial beings? We assume they are referring to what is known as the Sam Pepper Transcript, which was first published in September 1969 in the National Bulletin magazine, an entertainment publication without any journalistic rigor that was sold in supermarkets in the United States. Supposedly, a radio amateur named Sam Pepper had collected phrases from the Apollo 11. Astronauts that had been hidden from the public, such as, "There were other spaceships. They were lined up on the other edge of the crater. These creatures are gigantic, huge." Or, "We saw some visitors. They were here for a while observing the instruments." Thousands of radio amateurs listened to the transmissions that historic night, and none ever confirmed those supposed conversations. Buzz Aldrin himself stated, "Some say we saw little green men on the other side of the crater. It's the biggest nonsense I've ever heard." Apart from the issue of images and audio, skeptics also ask, quite logically, why does it seem so difficult for us now to return to the moon, if more than 50 years ago, with inferior technology, they succeeded repeatedly? Main issues currently delaying a return to the moon are not technological but economic, political, and scientific priorities. Any space project is very expensive, and the agencies do not have the same investment and government support of the days of the space race. NASA, for example, received 3% of the state budget at the time of Apollo 11. Now it receives 0.5%. Or put another way, in the U.S., space exploration was considered 6 times more important half a century ago. On the other hand, when it comes to exploring, it is much more profitable to invest in sending robots, as we are doing in the case of Mars, than in organizing manned missions. Robots are capable of taking samples, images, and making all kinds of measurements, and with them, you save having to cover the demanding biological needs of a human, which are many. This was already the case in the 1960s, but the publicity effect of sending people to the moon was, of course, much greater than that of sending remote-controlled vehicles. During the Cold War, it was considered worthwhile to send people up there. In any case, the most ambitious space project currently being developed is the Artemis, aimed at returning to the moon. But not just to take a short walk and come back, no. The goals of the Artemis program are to bring the first woman and the next man there, establish a sustainable presence on the lunar surface and orbit, and lay the foundations for a lunar economy. In November 2024, at least that is how it is scheduled, the Artemis II mission will take off towards the moon, the first manned mission in this program. 3 men and a woman will travel in the Orion spacecraft, although they will not land on the moon, but will prepare the way for a future mission, which will arrive 1 or 2 years later, and whose crew members will be the ones who set foot on our satellite again for the first time since 1972. Although the program is led by NASA, it has the support of half a dozen space agencies, such as the European or the Mexican, and it is expected to develop the technology necessary to take humans to Mars at some point in the 2040 AS. If all goes according to plan, over the next few years we will hear a lot of news about flights to the moon and deployments of satellites, space stations, robotic landers, and basic infrastructure of a lunar base. Now, we present a series of arguments confirming that humans have reached the moon. The first, and most obvious, are the retroreflectors that the astronauts of the Apollo 11, Apollo 14, and Apollo 15 missions left on the moon. In the image, you can see one installed by Armstrong and Aldrin. From Earth, a beam of laser light can be sent to them, which, when reflected, makes it possible to accurately measure the distance between the moon and Earth at a given moment. We have been making these types of measurements for decades, and thanks to them, we have learned that the moon moves away from our planet 3.8 centimeters every year. A second compelling argument, specifically weighing 382 kilograms, is the lunar rocks collected there. Radiometric dating of these rocks shows that they are much older than the oldest rocks found on our planet, confirming that they are not just earthly rocks pretending to be lunar. And why are the stones found on the moon older? Because the moon lacks geological activity, unlike the Earth. Here, crustal materials are buried over time, making it very rare to find rocks on the Earth's surface older than 3.6 billion years. By contrast, most of the lunar surface is between 4 and 4.4 billion years old. A third argument is the evidence that new lunar exploration missions continue to provide. Since 2009, The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter probe sends images of the moon, and in them, you can see the footprints of the astronauts and the traces of the different Apollo missions. Finally, those who think it was all a conspiracy by the U.S. government to deceive the entire world for some dark purpose should ask themselves a common-sense question. If more than 400,000 people from diverse backgrounds, nationalities, political persuasions, and religious beliefs were involved in the Apollo program, how could they have kept such a conspiracy secret for so long? How do you convince all these people to participate in the deception and never reveal the truth? And for what purpose would they have done such a thing? To divert public funds, as some conspiracy gurus defend? There are much easier and more discreet ways to do that. Or was it to pretend they had beaten the Soviets, the same ones who were already capable of sending probes to the moon and would have publicized the American hoax and embarrassed them? As we mentioned before, the thunderous Soviet silence about the feat of its rivals is, by itself, strong evidence against conspiracy theories. And you? What do you think about humans arriving on the moon? Have we clarified any of your doubts, or do new ones arise now? Us below in the comments. And if you want to know more interesting stories, subscribe to our channel. Thanks for tuning in, curious minds. See you in the next video.